evolutionary theory is their religious alternative to theism, and hence the anger, a religious anger. I turn to my final point. When discussing Al's essay, Reason and Belief in God, I mentioned that his argument for the falsehood of the evidentialist thesis concerning theistic belief came in two parts. The first part consisted of observing that if classical foundationalism is true, then so too is evidentialism, and then arguing that classical foundationalism is, in fact, false. But to show that that argument for evidentialism is untenable is, of course, not to show that evidentialism itself is untenable. Al's reason for holding that evidentialism is, in fact, untenable is that it doesn't fit the cases. He observed that religious believers sometimes believe things about God, not on the basis of propositional evidence, but because some experience has evoked the belief in them immediately. Perhaps one of the experiences to which Kant pointed, of the starry heavens above or of the moral law within. And Al then insisted that in at least some of these cases, there's nothing epistemologically deficient about the belief. It's not only basic, but properly basic. He acknowledged that there are and would be philosophers who would dispute his claim that such immediately held religious beliefs are proper. Many, but not all of those, will be hostile to religion. But he went on to argue that when a philosopher sets about trying to formulate a criterion for one concept or another, in the last resort he or she has no choice but to go by his or her reflective judgments about the cases. And that's what he was doing. Now, coming to the surface here is an understanding of what one might call the epistemology of philosophy that runs throughout Al's work. Usually this understanding has remained implicit. In his Notre Dame inaugural address of November 4, 1983, Advice to Christian Philosophers, it became fully explicit. Let me try to explain this understanding by contrasting it with what seems to me to have been Kant's understanding of the epistemology of philosophy. Late in the Pure Critique, Kant drew a distinction between what he called revelational theology and what he called rational theology. Rational theology, says Kant, is based solely upon reason. Though Kant does not explain there what it is for a theology to be based solely upon reason, from his subsequent identification and description of various forms of theology that he regards as based solely upon reason, in contrast to those not so based, I think one can form a pretty reliable inference as to how he was thinking. I think it's this. Theology is based solely upon reason in Kant's view, and is thus rational theology. Just in case it is based solely on premises and inferences that all cognitively competent adult human beings would accept, if those premises and reasons were presented to them, if they understood them, if they possessed the relevant background information, and if they freely reflected on them at sufficient length. What constitutes sufficient length is a nice question, of course. For the sake of convenience, let me call that complicated thing Kant rationality. Now, though I have extracted this idea of Kant rationality from the passage in the Pure Critique, in which Kant distinguishes various kinds of theology, it's obvious that the idea has application to the academic disciplines in general, and in particular to philosophy. Like this, a body of philosophical thought possesses Kant rationality, just in case it is based solely on premises and inferences that all cognitively competent adult human beings would accept if those premises and reasons were presented to them, if they understood them, if they possessed the relevant background information, and if they reflected freely on them at sufficient length. A body of philosophical thought that possesses Kant rationality will be foundationalist in structure. But since it's not required that the basis be limited to necessary truths that are self-evident and to contingent truths that are incorrigible, it will not be classically foundationalist in structure. Where the classical foundationalist wants a foundation that is certain, the person who aims at Kant rationality wants a foundation that is acceptable to all rational, reflective human beings, that being spelled out in the way indicated. I interpret Kant as holding that philosophy should aim at Kant rationality. and as holding that that's an achievable aim. It's my impression that he regarded his own philosophy as having achieved that aim, for the most part. Jürgen Habermas, in his writings over the past couple of decades, has described his own philosophy as post-metaphysical. And when one looks to see what he has in mind by that, it becomes pretty clear that central to what is definitive of what he calls post-metaphysical philosophy is that it possesses Kant rationality. And let me now stick my neck way out. I think that most philosophers in the modern period have thought that we should aim at something very close to Kant rationality in our practice of philosophy, and that this aim is in principle achievable. We should not expect that it ever will in fact be fully achieved, but aiming at it is not like banging your head on a concrete wall. Those who implicitly or explicitly understand themselves as aiming at Kant rationality are understandably shy of explaining just why it is that there are philosophers who disagree with them on philosophical points. Is it because they're not cognitively competent? Or because they don't fully understand the issues? Or because they haven't thought about the matter long enough? Or because their reflections are in some way not free? All the explanations are insulting. Nonetheless, my Yale colleague said that religious people suffer from, rationality deficit. Now, running throughout L's career, but coming to the surface most explicitly in his inaugural address, is, I submit, a very different understanding of the epistemology of philosophy. We must face up to the fact that it's an illusion to suppose that Kant rationality is achievable for any substantial body of philosophical thought. Over and over it turns out that philosophers who are fully rational find themselves in deep disagreement. And the advice Al gives to Christian philosophers presupposes his rejection of Kant rationality as the epistemology of philosophy. It's clear that he would give the same sort of advice that he gives in that lecture to philosophers of other convictions. So I think here's the idea. One enters philosophy as who one is, committed as one is committed, believing what one does believe on matters religious and otherwise, and one participates in the philosophical dialogue taking place. The secular humanist participates as a secular humanist, the Jewish person as Jewish, the secular naturalist as a secular naturalist, the Christian as a Christian. One listens carefully to one's fellow philosophers who contend that one's commitments are misguided, one's beliefs defective, one's philosophical conclusions mistaken. On some matters, large or small, one finds their arguments cogent, and so one changes one's mind. On other matters, large or small, one does not find their arguments cogent. So what does one do then? One retains the commitments, beliefs, and conclusions one already had, perhaps refined by the fuller's fire through which they have gone. What else is one to do? One cannot just choose no longer to believe what one did believe. And to those fellow philosophers whose commitments oneself finds misguided, whose beliefs one finds defective, whose philosophical conclusions one finds mistaken, one offers them arguments to that effect. One hopes that they'll find these arguments compelling, but one expects that often they won't. And so it goes back and forth. So what does one say to the philosopher who has listened carefully to the arguments and counter-arguments and remains or becomes a convinced secular naturalist? What else can one say but to your deepest convictions and commitments be true as you engage in dialogue with your fellow philosophers on philosophical issues? Be a naturalist philosopher. Show the rest of us where naturalist thinking goes. Maybe something will turn up that we can appropriate in our own way. And what does one say to the philosopher who has listened carefully to the arguments and counter-arguments and remains or becomes a convinced Christian? What else can one say? But to your deepest commitments and convictions be true as you engage in dialogue with your fellow philosophers on philosophical issues. Be a Christian philosopher. Show those who are of other persuasions where Christian thinking goes. Maybe something will turn up that they can appropriate in their own way. If the philosophical enterprise on